Today is Saturday, January 18th. It's official. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld a law banning the wildly popular social media platform TikTok over national security concerns, unless its Chinese owners sell it by the deadline. Well, that deadline is tomorrow, and at last check, there's been no sale. So what does a TikTok ban actually look like? And what can its 170 million American users expect next? Our guest today will help answer those questions and more. Coming up later, you'll hear from constitutional law expert Jessicalevenson about the Supreme Court justice's decision and what the options are legally for President-elect Trump moving forward. But first, let's talk about what users can expect when they try to log on to TikTok tomorrow. Sarah Needleman is a tech reporter for The Wall Street Journal. She's sharing more about what this ban might look like in real life, whether TikTok might still be saved, and what other apps are getting some attention in the meantime. Welcome to the Newsworthy Special Edition Saturday, when we sit down with a different expert or celebrity every Saturday to talk about something in the news. Don't forget to tune in every Monday through Friday for our regular episodes, where we provide all the day's news in 10 minutes. I'm Erica Mandy. It's now time for today's Special Edition Saturday. Sarah Needleman, thank you so much for joining us here on the Newsworthy.
It's my pleasure to be here.
So we now know the Supreme Court has upheld the law that Congress passed essentially banning TikTok in America. So on its own, assuming no other changes that we'll get into later that could happen, what could this quote-unquote ban actually look like on a practical level?
For starters, TikTok has said that it plans to fully shut down the app if the law goes into effect, according to Wall Street Journal reporting. So that is a possibility. According to the law, Apple and Google are obligated to remove TikTok from their app stores. So basically what that means is if you don't already have TikTok on your phone, you're not going to be able to download it to your phone or tablet from either of those places. And if you get a new phone, you're not going to be able to transfer the app to it. But the app itself, it's not going to vanish per se, but it might not work. That's because even though internet service providers like Verizon and Comcast aren't subject to the law, they would no longer be able to give their customers access to TikTok if Apple and Google do boot it from their app stores. There is also a possibility that Apple and Google respond to the law by only preventing TikTok from getting software updates, allowing it to essentially continue to exist in its current form. But that outcome wouldn't really protect the app for very long because updates are necessary for fixing bugs, patching security holes, and taking into account changes that Apple and Google make to their mobile operating systems. So under that circumstance, the app would likely degrade in quality over time, possibly even in a matter of weeks. It would become totally unusable.
And has TikTok said anything about how it's going to handle it come Sunday?
Some of the Wall Street Journal reporting has, we've heard that the company does plan to shut down the app if the law goes into effect. And part of the reason is that any of its partner companies that don't comply with the law would be liable for very expensive daily fines. Shutting down the app protectively would also prevent a situation where TikTok would be essentially seemingly thumbing its nose at Congress.
Yeah, so potentially, come Sunday, users could log on and see some sort of message or just it's not working.
It could see a message from TikTok saying, sorry, we've gone docked because of the law. It could still potentially work briefly, but it really does look like Apple and Google are going to have to remove it from their stores to avoid facing any hefty fines. And it does look like Oracle, which is TikTok's cloud hosting provider, it's likely not to continue providing that service, again, out of fear of getting fined. So, it could essentially go dark on Sunday. I mean, it may only be temporary. It is possible that the app will come back in a few days from now or longer, depending on what happens with the next administration.
So President Biden has now said he won't enforce this, and Trump takes over on Monday anyway, but it sounds like TikTok may move forward with at least temporarily shutting it down just to avoid any sort of liability for themselves or their partners.
Correct.
Regardless of what Biden is saying, to be clear.
Correct.
Okay, so then President-elect Trump takes over on Monday. What is he saying and what are his options?
What he said today in a post online was that his decision on TikTok will be made in the not too distant future, but he needs time to review the situation and said, stay tuned.
Do you have an idea of what are some of the things that he could choose to do? I mean, Congress passed this law. Can he choose to ignore it or not enforce it?
So he has indicated that he wants to come to the app's rescue. It is possible that he could refuse to enforce the ban or push Congress to eliminate it through new legislation, but it would still be risky for Google and Apple to restore TikTok if the law is still on the books. Some legal scholars say the Trump administration could lift the ban without going through Congress if his administration determines the site is no longer under Chinese control.
TikTok has said in the past, though, right, that it's not interested in selling. But as we've seen, people and companies can change their minds.
Right. TikTok has said it can't and it won't sell. But at the end of the day, if that is the choice between completely going dark and selling it, it's certainly possible. We have seen companies change their minds. That is another wait and see situation we have upon us.
What happens to TikTok creators, especially those whose livelihood is made on the app, but also just the millions of Americans who use the app on a daily basis?
So for the creators, certainly they have a number of other options they can go to. There's, Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts are very similar. There are a lot of other smaller ones that have come up like Flip, Triller, Likey. These are similar in scope. And so it's certainly possible that creators will go to those or to some of the bigger ones.
And they've already been telling some of their followers, like, make sure you're following me on other apps in case this.
Yes. In fact, because we thought a ban might have happened years ago, even with the first Trump administration, there was talk of TikTok going away. Since then, some creators have been diversifying. Like you said, they're putting on their TikTok pages, follow me over here or there. Certainly the talent managers that represent some of the top creators have been pushing them to go in that direction. As for users, certainly they can also go to these other alternatives that I mentioned. But we have seen just in the past few days a huge surge in downloads of two other apps, Lemon 8 and another one many Americans refer to as Red Note, but it's a Chinese app and a Chinese name. Like TikTok, Lemon 8 is owned by Beijing-based ByteDance, so it is subject to the same law and could go dark on Sunday. This other one that I mentioned, Red Note, is also called Little Red Book. That has a different Chinese owner, so it would be spared.
And some users downloaded this Chinese app with a Chinese name that is being referred to as Red Note to spite lawmakers who banned this. What's your take on that?
This is a Chinese app. It's full of Chinese language. And so it is in some ways humorous because these Americans, in most cases, don't speak the language and don't know what's going on. But it is a sign of TikTok users saying, well, you don't like us going to TikTok, we'll go over to another Chinese app. And so it is interesting that they've chosen to go in that direction. It does seem like a little bit of a snub to Congress and saying, well, now you're going to have to go after this one if you have a problem with us on it.
Any notable impact so far to Instagram and some of the other familiar apps that we talked about?
We haven't seen any big surge for those. I mean, first of all, they're already pretty darn big as it is because, as we mentioned earlier, a lot of the creators have been diversifying and have already moved over there. It's not like there needs to be an immediate change in behavior. I think a lot of people are just sort of waiting to see what happens on Sunday. Again, this has been a back and forth situation where TikTok's going to go. No, it's not. It's going to go. Yes, it's saved. People have just sort of become almost jaded at this point. The problem is there's so many options that it's hard to tell if we're going to see a big surge to any one.
Can you speak to how unprecedented this is, as well as like kind of that progression that you've seen over the years of how we got here?
It is certainly unprecedented for a social media app. We haven't seen that happen before, although we have seen social media apps booted from app stores like Parler and Fortnite for totally different reasons, though. This is about national security. And so we haven't seen that before with a social media app or really anything that is so popular among consumers. This is really unusual where we're talking about something that's beloved by millions of Americans that's become sort of integrated into people's everyday lives. That's affected. There's some 7 million small businesses on the app. Scores of creators do make their living entirely off of TikTok. And so it is pretty unusual, especially because it's this issue of security and free speech. There's a lot of debate over what's right and what's wrong in this situation.
Do you have a prediction for where things are going to stand, one day, 1 week, 1 month, 1 year from now?
It's really hard to say. I do think President-elect Trump, when he says he's going to look into the matter and see if it can be saved, that he will try that. But at the end of the day, it's a bipartisan bill that was passed. The Supreme Court, has now given it pretty close attention and still went ahead and said, yep, let's ban it. So to me, that says there's some pretty compelling evidence to suggest that it is indeed a national security threat. Like we said earlier, there's always a possibility that a sale will end up happening, which would satisfy the requirements of the law. I think that possibility still exists. It's really hard to tell. If I knew the answer, that would be great, but I don't have a time machine.
Still ahead, we're talking about the legal side of all of this, from why the U.S. Supreme Court decided what it did to what options President-elect Trump has to try to save TikTok if he wants to. Constitutional law expert Jessicalevenson joins us next. She's a professor at Loyola Law School and host of the Passing Judgment podcast, where she explains how the biggest political and legal issues of the moment affect you. But first, a quick break for our sponsors. The Newsworthy is brought to you by Lumi. If you need a new deodorant this new year to be your best-smelling, most confident self, look no further than Lumi Whole Body Deodorant. I am always impressed by this stuff. It's paraben and baking soda free, and all the products I use are aluminum free, although they do have great sweat control options if you prefer. But most importantly, in my experience, Lumi Whole Body Deodorant works to keep me smelling fresh. Lumi is safe to use anywhere on your body and has a bunch of convenient options, from a solid stick to spray deodorant to on-the-go deodorant wipes and more. Plus, you can choose from a variety of scents like clean tangerine, which I love for the body wash, or minted cucumber or toasted coconut, or just unscented. You can try a variety with Lumi's starter pack. It's perfect for new customers. It comes with a solid stick deodorant, cream tube deodorant, 2 free products of your choice like mini body wash and deodorant wipes, and free shipping. As a special offer for listeners, new customers get 15% off all Lumi products with our exclusive code. And if you combine that 15% off with the already discounted starter pack, well, that equals over 40% off their starter pack. So use code NEWSWORTHY for 15% off your first purchase at LumiDeodorant.com. That's code NEWSWORTHY at LumiDeodorant.com. Please support our show and tell them we sent you. Smell fresher, stay drier, and boost your confidence from head to toe with Lumi. The Newsworthy is also brought to you by Delete Me. Ever wonder how much of your personal data is out there on the internet for anyone to see? It's probably more than you think. Your name, contact info, social security number, home address, even information about your family members are all being compiled by data brokers and sold online. And this can lead to things like identity theft, spam calls, and more. That's why I'm so impressed by Delete Me. It's a subscription service I now use to get information about me on hundreds of data broker websites removed and deleted. They sent me a personalized privacy report detailing what info they found, where they found it, and what they were able to remove. And then Delete Me continues to work for you, constantly monitoring and removing the personal information you don't want on the internet. To put it simply, Delete Me does all the hard work of wiping your and your family's personal information from data broker websites. So take control of your data and keep your private life private by signing up for Delete Me, now at a special discount for our listeners. Today, get 20% off your Delete Me plan by texting Newsworthy to 64,000. Text Newsworthy to 64,000. That's Newsworthy to 64000. Message and data rates may apply, so see terms for details. Now to my conversation with Jessicalevenson. Jessicalevenson, thank you for joining us here on the Newsworthy.
Thanks for having me back.
So the Supreme Court's decision upheld the law basically banning TikTok, and it was a unanimous decision. Can you walk us through a couple of the main reasons the justices gave for this decision?
I think the biggest reason all boils down to 2 words, and those are national and security. So as we know, this was a law that said to ByteDance, which owns TikTok, either sell TikTok or shut it down. And we can talk about what shut it down means, but basically that app stores in the US can no longer offer TikTok and people can't update it. And the government actually came forward with 2 reasons. One was the idea that we as US users could be subject to Chinese propaganda. The other was that there is a data privacy concern. And in this unanimous decision, what you really saw is the court agreeing on the data privacy concern, not as much agreement on the propaganda. We see this over and over again when the president and Congress say, we are worried about national security. Oftentimes you see federal judges who are not elected, not accountable, and they know that, defer to the political branches.
Yeah, so talk a little bit about what TikTok's argument was against this and why it didn't ultimately hold up.
Yeah, so TikTok and TikTok creators both came to the Supreme Court with the argument that this piece of legislation violated their First Amendment rights. So there was some question as to whether or not TikTok, as a U.S. company, actually enjoys First Amendment rights or the same First Amendment rights as individuals. And part of that was related to how TikTok functions and whether or not we should view it as a newspaper or as something else. And then there were, of course, the arguments that were made by those who use TikTok, some for their livelihood. And really their argument was our First Amendment rights are infringed upon. Now, I think it's worth noting that the lower court that reviewed this case, the D.C. Circuit, also ruled against TikTok and the creators. And basically what the lower court said, and I read the Supreme Court as adopting much of that reasoning, was I'm not sure that we actually are limiting anybody's First Amendment rights, because if ByteDance decides to sell TikTok to an American company, then you can have the same users posting the same content. And so whose First Amendment rights are really being infringed upon? Now, I should note here that there's some disagreement about this, it looks like, among the justices. But number one, there might not be a First Amendment argument at all. And number two, the court says this is content neutral. We're not targeting any particular person or any particular type of speech, given the privacy concerns here. And so we're going to apply something called an intermediate or a middle level of review and find that it's satisfied here.
And while it sounds like there were some disagreements about the details, ultimately, this was a unanimous decision. Did that surprise you to see the justices all agreeing?
It didn't. And I know now after the fact, of course, I could say it didn't surprise me. Aren't I smart? But the truth is, after reading the D.C. Circuit's decision, that was, again, the Court of Appeals in this case, and after listening to oral arguments, I would have been very surprised if this was anything other than a unanimous decision to uphold. Now, again, you can see cracks where there are disagreements about exactly how we should treat this law. Is it a ban? Is it a direct assault on the First Amendment? Does it survive anyway? But I think what you saw is the justices really determining that, let's remember, we're talking about a law with broad bipartisan support. And again, in the government looking and members of Congress looking at sensitive classified information and saying, we're concerned. We're concerned for the safety of users in this country. And so I think, frankly, any other decision would have been the shock.
So as you mentioned, Congress passed this with bipartisan support. But President-elect Trump is saying, I'm going to take a look at this, and we're waiting to hear how he's going to respond. If President-elect Trump decides not to enforce this ban, is that legal, or can he just not follow a law passed by Congress? What are his options here?
Well, the first option is, of course, we're talking about a piece of legislation, not the Constitution. So President Trump could assume office and say to Congress, let's repeal this piece of legislation. Let's overturn it. And all that would be preventing him from doing that is political will. This Supreme Court case doesn't say you have to have this ban. It says Congress can impose this, not it must. So number one is you could repeal the legislation. You asked me specifically about not enforcing the legislation. And certainly the president could direct his attorney general to say, we won't enforce this ban. Now, of course, the companies that host apps who would be targeted by this particular law might feel uneasy about doing that. They're having to rely on the attorney general saying, don't worry, I won't come after you. And that's essentially the prosecutorial discretion of, we know this law is on the books, but we're not going to enforce it. So that is, while I think possible, it would be risky. And I think a lot of hosts, those who provide platforms for us to obtain TikTok, I think they might be anxious about doing that.
So we're talking about Apple and Google because they have the app stores,
exactly.
Companies like
Thank
that.
You.
Yeah. So we've already seen many TikTok users migrating to other apps, including a Chinese-owned app that many are calling Red Note. Could that also be subject to a ban?
My understanding is not under this particular law because of how it was written, but certainly given the court's reasoning here, Congress could pass another law if, again, President Trump would sign it. But you would need the same type of evidence that we have here. And you would need the court to believe that that new law looks a lot like the law that they just upheld.
Does this kind of set a precedent going forward at all?
So I think it certainly sets the precedent that Congress has the power to impose this type of ban or forced divestiture, depending on how you want to categorize it. But again, it's not saying, Congress, you can ban any social media app that you want. You really have to, I think, convince the court that Meta is not like TikTok, that a U.S.-owned company is not like a company owned by a foreign adversary. And that really was the key to this case.
During Trump's first administration, when this was floated, it kind of felt outlandish, like that wouldn't happen. And here we are, that it actually has happened years later. What's your take on getting to this place and how unprecedented it is?
I think what we see is the political branches and now the judicial branch struggling with something they're going to have to continue to struggle with, which is social media apps, how they function, and how much of a threat they pose to us, to the users, and where the First Amendment is going to act as a stop against what Congress and the president might want to do. Now, in terms of President Trump previously trying to ban TikTok, that was done through an executive order. And the problem was really the form of how he tried to implement the ban. Here we see, once you go through the legislative process, if the court is convinced that there's enough evidence here that there's a real national security concern and a data privacy concern, then there's the power for the government to act. The question, I think, is really all of the questions that the court didn't answer and that the court didn't go bigger. And this type of case is going to come up again. We're still going to have to figure out, how do we treat social media companies? How much do we think our political branches can and should, quote unquote, protect us from them?
Final thought or takeaway for our audience.
One, the Supreme Court can act quickly when it needs to. Two, what we see is, this is the new frontier. It is not just social media. It's not just online speech. It's also this combination of what we often see. It's national security versus the First Amendment. And the court came out where we typically expect it to, which is once the president and Congress say national security, the court says okay.
Thank you to both of our guests today. Be sure to follow Sarah Needleman's coverage of the tech industry in the Wall Street Journal and listen to Professor Jessicalevenson's podcast called Passing Judgment. We have links to their work in today's episode notes on our website, thenewsworthy.com. If you found this episode helpful or informative, please be sure to share it online or with a friend. We always appreciate you helping us spread the word, so thank you. A quick reminder, we will not have our typical 10-minute daily news roundup this Monday because of the federal holiday, Martin Luther King Jr. Day. But we will be back on Tuesday to bring you the latest with TikTok, the inauguration, and all the other news to know. So thank you so much for being here and have a great long weekend.